All right, I would like to start our second round of lightning speakers by welcoming Adrian Williams. Hi, Adrian.
Hello. I'll just share my slides. Can you all see this okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the main phase of a retrospective enhancement project I've implemented at University of Kentucky Libraries. This project has involved adding Homosaurus terms to our library catalog by way of OCLC connection in order to improve the searchability and inclusiveness of our LGBTQ+ related library materials. A little background here. The University of Kentucky is a public land grant university in Lexington, Kentucky. It has a current enrollment of about 30,000 students, 22,000 of them being undergraduates and around 8,000 being graduates or postgraduates. The UK Library's cataloging and metadata department has around 11 employees. The Homosaurus is an international linked data controlled vocabulary. The first version of it was created by Jack Vanderwell for the ILIA LGBT Heritage Archive. It's gone through 2 revisions so far, and it currently has roughly 2,000 terms that are meant to supplement general controlled vocabularies like LCSH. Homosaurus covers topics that include gender diversity and variance, sexual identity and orientation, as well as general terms that hold a queer context in history, such as surrogacy, enemas, Amazons, etc. This project to add Homosaurus terms to our LGBTQ+ library materials began as a proof of concept in January of 2020. After this proof of concept proved successful, the main project began in September 2020. This main phase started with pulling a report of the unsuppressed bibliographic records we have with the Library of Congress subject heading sexual minorities. Sexual minorities is the heading that's used to describe LGBTQ+ people as a group. It's the term that has the most agreed upon literary warrant, and so it was established as the authorized subject heading, but it is also a term that only the rare LGBTQ person would use to describe themselves. The main facet of this project was performing subject assignment. It was taking a second look at the aboutness of these materials, identifying the limitations in LCSH's language, and then identifying what Homosaurus terms could fill those language and context gaps. Once those Homosaurus terms were identified, I added them into the item's master bibliographic record and OCLC connection. Adding them to the master records rather than to just our local records has made it so that other libraries can benefit from this work. I would then export and overlay that enhanced record into our ALMA instance. There are 2 places to put Homosaurus terms in the MARC record, the 650 field for subject terms and the 655 field for genre form terms. The first indicator can be left blank, or it can be made a 1 to indicate that this is a primary heading for the title, or a 2 to indicate that it's a secondary heading for the title. The second indicator is 7, which indicates that the source code for the controlled vocabulary is present in the delimiter 2 field. The source code for Homosaurus is homo-it. Part of what helped in this subject assignment were the scope notes on some of the Homosaurus terms. I was able to glean some context from those scope notes, but I also went to websites that discussed or explained these vocabulary terms, giving priority, of course, to websites that were authored by or had directly consulted people who belong to those identities and communities. As of this month of August, I've completed about 45% of the 400 records included in the main part of this project. The topics that I was able to add terms to the most were on political action and activism, the mental and physical health of LGBTQ+ people, the experiences of LGBTQ+ youth in schools, and discrimination and or violence against LGBTQ+ people. As said earlier, I'm almost halfway through this current project, and In the coming months, I'll be continuing on with this work and hopefully finishing by the end of the year. The first half of this project, I didn't add URIs for the Homosaurus terms into their fields because my library's Alma instance has had issues with URI redundancies and searchability. But after some feedback, I've discussed it with my head of department about a workaround to this. And I've begun to add the URIs and plan to go back to those first half and add the URIs to those as well. Once finished entirely, I hope to have a discussion with my department about working on a policy for including Homosaurus in our regular, complex, and original cataloging processes. Retrospective enhancement has definitely made a positive effect on our catalog, but it would perhaps be more efficient if these terms were added from the get-go. Philosophically, this work is never going to be done, and that's okay. There's probably always going to be more we can do to make our library catalogs more inclusive for our users and our description more reflective of the people we describe. I look forward to pursuing this work further. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to any questions, comments, or critiques.
Thank you, Adrian. I'd now like to welcome Heather Cole.
Hi, everybody. Let me just start to share. And good. There it is. Okay, so it happens all the time. An undergraduate in a special collections class session who perhaps has never interacted with primary sources before discovers an object, an annotation, a connection with a person who lived and died hundreds of years ago, and for a moment understands the possibility those materials hold. But once that class session ends, the student forgets that experience or dismisses it as unrelated to their academic interests. While hundreds of students visit Brown's John Hay Library each year for classes, students don't often return to the library, and their engagement with collections tends to begin and end with those one-hour sessions. I wanted to find a way to increase student use of our collections while also demonstrating how material can be used in innovative and inspiring ways. I created the library's undergraduate fellowship program to encourage self-directed exploration of special collections. Now in its third year, the program serves as a primary source research bootcamp, allowing students to develop projects over 10 weeks in the summer. Mentored by library staff and supported by the cohort of fellows, the students produce high-quality, innovative research. Some projects are traditional research papers and might become senior theses. Others are creative. We welcome and support both equally. What matters is that students engage closely with collections to produce something meaningful. I pack the first half of the summer with hands-on or virtual workshops, discussions on book history and archival silences, and weekly sessions where I bring the students together to talk through the discoveries and frustrations the research process can bring. One popular session is an exploration of how to research queerness in pre-20th century special collections materials. In addition, colleagues and I meet weekly with each student individually to talk through their projects and suggest solutions to the challenges that arise. The program culminates in a fall showcase in which each student prepares a 10-minute presentation or performance for an audience of students, faculty, and staff. It's important to me that we hold the program in the summer when the students don't have other things going on. That way they can focus completely on the research process, on figuring out what to do when a hypothesis doesn't pan out in the archive they're examining, how to reframe an argument, or how to learn about the highs and lows of going through a collection box by box, folder by folder. And the students produce some amazing work. I want to highlight a sampling of projects that have made use of some of our queer collections. It's endlessly rewarding to see queer students and students interested in queer representation find inspiration in them. I encourage projects that incorporate traditional research as well as creative work. Alan Mendoza Sosa explored the Hayes collection of gay pulp fiction and zines and created an artist book titled Night Skies Glitter, which included an original poem about queerness and immigration. Alan's final project was a sophisticated distillation of a number of themes observed in Hay collection materials, interwoven with their own experience. Often the fellow's summer work is only the beginning of larger research projects. As a fellow, sophomore Finch Collins, who's here today, hi Finch, studied negotiations of queer identity through fandom and the extent that fandom can serve as a site of reclamation and identity creation. As his Brown career progressed, Finch built on the research he'd done at the Hay, which resulted in a senior thesis, Trans at the Table, an archive of oral histories of queer gamers. Sometimes fellows' projects end up adding to the archives they're studying. Last summer, Matthew Marciello researched gender theorist Anne Fausto Sterling's papers on intersexuality. My colleagues and I were able to connect them with Dr. Fausto Sterling, and the two began a lively correspondence around her work. We hope to add that correspondence to her archive. And one last example, sometimes these students show us completely new ways of engaging with our collections. Maddie Slater spent last summer exploring the personal ads in our archive of lesbian periodical On Our Backs. Maddie created an immersive text-based video game in which a player navigates a sexual encounter. As librarians, we can offer a different line of support and inspiration for these students. The students gain an additional set of allies who can help them generate project ideas that come out of their own passions and curiosity. We can direct them to materials they may not expect to find in a special collections library, and in turn, they can direct us to new areas in which to develop collections. My goal is for every single student at Brown to spend some of their time exploring the wealth of resources that the Hay has to offer, and to take what they learn there and apply it to whatever endeavor they pursue next. We're always exploring ways to do that better and to continue to acquire and make available collections in which they can see themselves represented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'd now like to welcome Amber Dierking and Avi Woontner.
Hello. Let me know if there are any problems. So welcome everybody. We're talking about re-envisioning cataloging and classification for an LGBTQIA+ community library. I'm Avi Woontner and I use they, them pronouns.
Hi everybody, my name is Amber Dierking and I am one of the Arts and Humanities Liaison Librarians at Grand Valley State University, which is in Western Michigan. And as soon as Avi plays the slides here, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I, for one, want to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, or the people of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi.
And I'm here today on the traditional lands of the Kiowa people, White Shell Water Place, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we're talking today about Out on the Shelves, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. We're very grateful to be working for these communities, and these projects that we talk about, we work to respect and reflect our Two-Spirit siblings in all of the work that we do.
So we thought we'd start off with a brief introduction for those of you who are not already familiar with Out on the Shelves. It is the oldest and largest community-run LGBTQIA library in Western Canada. It's always been volunteer and community-run. It's donation-based. The collections include both fiction and nonfiction, and we've been using Koha as the ILS and OPAC. And here you see a brief peek inside the library. I'll pass it off to Avi.
So Out on the Shelves started in a community center in Vancouver, and after a while wasn't able to stay in that place anymore. Some volunteers saved the collection, and it was held across various garages and storage spaces for about 2 years, until students at the iSchool offered to bring the library to UBC campus. Volunteers then began to identify some of the biggest needs for Out on the Shelves to grow, and they proposed practicum projects to the iSchool so that students could focus on this work for school credit.
So the first big project that we got to start off with was a classification system, which I was lucky enough to do. And why was this the priority? While previous volunteers and community members had been saying that the old system wasn't working for some time now, it had been built really haphazardly over the past 30 years with no consistent or cohesive terminology or organizing principles. It was outdated, it wasn't conducive to browsing, and didn't always reflect what the collection actually is. The image you see is the new system that I built. And since the collection was pretty small, we had a really unique opportunity to build something entirely from scratch. And to do that, I solicited a lot of feedback and input, did a lot of research, sketched out various options, and spent quite a lot of time in the stacks. And one of the most essential elements of building this new system up was that it be mutable, that it be explicitly designed to change from the start. That's reflected in all the documentation and training materials. And new volunteers are encouraged to alter the system however they see fit moving forwards, so it's always changeable and not static. Then as co-coordinator, I also led the implementation of the new system, which involved reclassing and reshelving the entire library. And another project was going on at the same time. So we're going to pop over to Avi to that second project that was also happening.
There we go. So for my project, my goal was to improve the organizational systems of our library's OPAC and make sure that we could continue, oh my goodness, continue to adapt to changes in the community and our collection. I began with research into critiques of Library of Congress subject headings, alternative thesauri, and folksonomies, and then presented out on the shelf volunteers with a number of options for my path forward. We had about a week of open community feedback, which determined that option 3 would be ideal for our needs. And here is a snippet of the finished local thesaurus. Alongside the thesaurus, I developed a few cataloging guidelines based on principles of retrieval, non-offensive terminology, inclusivity and plurality, and adaptability. The thesaurus consists of 3 main sections. The first are approved headings to be used like you would normally any thesaurus. Then the second was to change these headings for terms that we wanted to replace when we found them in records that we were copy cataloging. And then the last one was apply whenever possible headings for terms that we thought were especially important to have represented in our collections. So all that was left was to begin beta testing. And here's a picture from the training and cataloging party that we had with volunteers in February of 2020. So the last time that I saw most of the people in person. And what comes next, you'll have to stay tuned.
Yeah, we've included a few links to more information here. We wrote a paper that digs into more detail, and we thank you all so much for listening. And yeah, stay tuned to hear from Rio and Laura about some more current and ongoing projects for Out on the Shelves.
Thank you.
All right, Rio and Laura.
All right, let me start sharing my screen. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Laura Kruger. I'm presenting to you today from the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe in the Bay Area, along with Rio Piccolo, who will be speaking from the traditional unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I will give a brief intro and Rio will follow with a more in-depth description of our project. Out on the Shelves is Vancouver's independent volunteer-run LGBTQIA+ library, the same library you heard about in Avi and Amber's presentation. Their project focused on input from users, and our work focuses on input from creators. It's a small collection that prioritizes own voices works by authors who are members of communities about which they are writing, and has student involvement from UBC's iSchool, allowing for creativity and developing the best practice cataloging practices for the collection. With grant funding, Rio and Dr. Julia Bullard have developed and will continue to define a protocol for contacting living creators represented in the collection and learn how they would like themselves and their materials to be described in the catalog. At the heart of this project is an understanding that individuals often come to the library seeking books and materials by or about people like them. And this project seeks to address that problem from multiple angles in the catalog. Reflecting the needs and identities of users in the catalog raises important questions such as, how do we process changes to creators' identities as they may shift over time? How does this relate to different works? Whose place is it to assert a creator's identity and decide how it is phrased? How can controlled terms and term relationships respect a creator's expressions while meeting the discoverability and access needs of users? Now over to you, Rio.
Thanks. Yeah, as Laura mentioned, these are the sorts of questions that have prompted us to refine our cataloging and classification in a way that's both useful for patrons as well as authentic to creators. The current limitations for queer labeling in Library of Congress subject headings is well documented, as folks familiar with Homosaurus are aware, but here are a couple of examples to start. The first are the subject headings for Samantha Irby's Wow, No Thank You, a collection that includes essays about her coming out as queer and her relationship with her wife, among other things. However, those aspects are not reflected in the subject headings in LC. It's worth noting that her identity as a woman and as African-American are reflected here, but queerness isn't, despite it also being a large part of the author's self-identity and in her work as well. The next one is for Zaina Arafat's novel, You Exist Too Much. The term coming out here definitely indicates queer content, presumably coming out as a lesbian according to the genre form term there, but that's also incorrect. LC just doesn't have a term for bisexual fiction. The book summary mentions that this is a story of self-discovery and coming out, but it doesn't acknowledge the character as bisexual. So the issue of representation, and in this case, bi erasure, gets further complicated with the cataloging choices that are made. And it's not uncommon for queerness to be obscured or downplayed like this in the meta text of the book, to the point that readers and catalogers alike can't really identify them. Queer identity labels are most often assigned ad hoc when they're presented clearly in the marketing, and the vocabulary terms for those already exist. So what we have here is a twofold problem of insufficient terminology, which alternatives like Homosaurus are working to correct, as well as insufficient information about the content of the work for catalogers who are making decisions based primarily on metadata provided by the publisher. So at UTS, we've tended to make decisions about subject description based on information from third-party sources as well, like reviews or the author's social media, to fill in those gaps. This Our Own Labels project is intended to emphasize the creator as a direct part of the cataloging process. So we'll be interviewing authors and recataloging their work based on their direct input through interviews. And here are a couple of examples of questions. The majority of UTS collection is fiction, so some of the questions focus on the content of the work, specifically like character identities, and other questions focus on the author themselves, their identity, their preferred terms, as well as how they feel about this idea of the catalog record, including information about them and what that should entail. I'm especially curious here about how folks view like processing changes to personal identity and the relationship between personal and professional identity, what aspects of self we share with audiences and for what purpose, and that sort of thing. Other questions will focus on helping us gather information for longevity and scalability like this here. Identity labels are obviously very personal for the most part, but language is always evolving. So that's something we're thinking about in terms of how catalog records can stand the test of time as well. In terms of outcome from these interviews, the direct result will be to recatalog works based on the author's input and extrapolating where we can to improve our cataloging process overall. But also we'll be incorporating Homosaurus terms and developing solutions for including subject terms for creators and works of fiction. More broadly, we aim to develop channels for living creators to continue to have input on the representation of their work in the library's descriptive systems as well. At this point, we're still at the early stages of this project. We've piloted the interview protocol and we'll be refining the protocol and interviewing authors starting in September of this year. We're really excited about the future of this project. And UTS is a small, very specialized collection, which gives us a lot of room to experiment and test out these initiatives that we hope will have a much larger impact down the road. But yeah, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Laura and Rio. And now our final speaker, Emily, are you there?
I am indeed. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Baumgardt. I am an archives processing technician here at the Music Division of the Library of Congress. I'm going to be speaking today about making our LGBTQ+ special collections discoverable. The words and opinions expressed here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Library of Congress. So when I began this project in March of 2020, I needed a project to work on at home. I noticed that we had really no discoverability for LGBTQ collections on any of our public facing pages. You see here our sort of main landing page. There was nothing here about what LGBTQ holdings we had, where they were, how to find them. So I wanted to really work on fixing that. Began a survey of our special collections. I focused on the special collections because number one, that's sort of my day-to-day job when I am actually working on site and there's not a pandemic going on. And number two, because it felt like a manageable thing to do. There were about 500 special collections when I started, as opposed to looking through every single book and musical score we have at the Library of Congress, which felt a little daunting. And I knew going into this that we did have some LGBTQ individuals in our holdings. Primarily, we focused a lot on these two individuals. That's Leonard Bernstein on the left and Aaron Copland on the right, who were two important American composers. But it always felt a little tokenizing to me to sort of focus so heavily on them when I knew that we had to have a lot of other individuals and materials in our holdings that we could really emphasize and really just showcase their accomplishments in the field of the performing arts. So I started a survey, like I said, took down the title of the collection, whether it was processed, the catalog record, and the finding aid PEARL if those existed, relevant materials, that is, whether there was correspondence or musical scores or subject heading or subject files, writings, things like that, and then whether there were ethical concerns or offensive language. And luckily, I did not actually find much of that latter category. Ethical concerns basically broke down into two things. One, whether the individual had an unclear identity. As with many historical individuals, we can't be sure whether they would have actually fallen under the LGBTQ umbrella. So those individuals were not included in the data. As for closeted individuals, we did include them if their identity had become public knowledge, but if it was not public knowledge, we did not include them. I wanted to make sure that we were not outing anyone using our collections. And the results of that survey, out of those about 500 special collections, 40 collections focused on an LGBTQ plus individual or an organization founded by such an individual, like Lincoln Kirstein's Ballet Caravan. In doing this, however, we did find some gaps. We only had 6 of those 40 collections focusing on women, only 3 focused on people of color, and there were no trans or non-binary individuals in those 40 collections. However, I wanted to sort of broaden our horizons and our searches as I was going through this. So in addition, I also searched through every single indexing term or the 700 subject fields for all of these collections and found in 82 further collections where LGBTQ plus individuals or materials do appear, but they are not the focus of the collection, which really broadened the scope of what I thought that we had in our holdings. So for instance, I mentioned Aaron Copland earlier. In addition to having his collection, we also identified 26 further special collections in which he appears, which really emphasizes not only his importance for the field, but also just how interconnected the field of performing arts is and how interconnected the queer community is in that field as well. So I wanted to make sure now that we had this data to actually tell the public about it. We began just with a static Word document that we posted on our website. You can see the title of that here, that had brief descriptions of each of these collections with where to find it, a little bit about them. And I mentioned in the abstract of this talk, we were working on making this a LibGuide. I'm happy to announce that that guide is now live. So it takes that same data from the static version and then expands upon it. We included web archives, online exhibits, other special collections we have in our holdings. So now that special collection section is much more dynamic and it's much more user-friendly. The original Word document was just 50 pages worth of text. And now here we've broken it up into the main LGBTQ collections page and then those related pages where those 82 further collections were, as well as just a little tab about how to use finding aids in case a patron is unfamiliar with that, since they can be a little bit confusing documents if you've never seen them before. But like I said, we also included a lot of other things beyond our special collections. And in doing so, also kept broadening that idea of sort of what we would include here. So for instance, we have an online exhibit about music and animation, which pulls a lot from the Howard Ashman collection. So we included that here. We have the Performing Arts Web Archive that crawls a lot of LGBTQ spaces. We included that here as well. Things like the Martha Graham collection, her digital collection we have, that includes a lot of material on Eric Hawkins, which is all to say that I think it's really easy, especially for those of us in mainstream institutions. It's really easy to think, oh, we don't have a lot of LGBTQ materials. We don't have a lot of LGBTQ individuals in our holdings. But by doing this work, I was able to find that actually we had a lot more than I expected. They just were sort of hiding in places you might not expect to find them. So thank you so much for listening, and I would enjoy and value your questions.
Thank you very much, Emily. All right, I would now like to welcome back Adrian Williams, Heather Cole, Avi Woontner, Amber Dierking, Rio Piccolo, Laura Kruger, and Emily Baumgardt to answer questions. We've got some ready here. Adrian, you're gonna get bombarded.
I'm ready.
Anyone who has questions for anyone other than Adrian, go ahead and submit that to the Q&A so Adrian can get a break at some point. Adrian, if it's not too much into the weeds, can you talk about what issues you were seeing in Alma adding the URIs to $0.
Yes, but
And how you worked? Sorry, words bad.
you're totally fine.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was more problems so this was sort of fixed by the iOS coordinator before my time. I started working at UK Libraries in January of 2020. And prior to that, they had issues in the URIs and the 1xx fields repeating in Alma and in InfoCat, which is our discovery system. And the way that they solved that was by scrubbing delimiter zeros as soon as they entered our Alma instance. And so in my discussion with my head of department, we found a way to just scrub the ones in the 1xx and leave the ones in the 6xx's so that those are still in our systems. Yeah, so really just issues with redundancy and just messiness. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And Adrian, verifying that the updates are being made in Alma's IZ/metadata editor, or is this being done in OCL connection or question mark?
Okay. So these are for institute. I have a little rubric of if it's an institutional zone record, then it is the Homosaurus terms are added in connection/WorldCat and then overlaid back into Alma. If it's a community zone record with an OCLC number attached, then Homosaurus terms are added in the connection record, and then but not overlaid back into Alma. They're sort of re-exported into Alma during a different process that I'm not involved with. And then if there are community zone records that do not have an OCLC number, then I generally left those alone. Community zone records are records that are used by the whole community. So or the consortium. So if you make a change in that record, it's in other libraries. And so I didn't want to make a change in another library's, catalog without their permission. So I added them to OCLC, and then people can make the choice within themselves whether to put it in their own libraries.
Beautiful, thank you. For Laura and Rio, your project sounds amazing. Do you have any plans or ideas about sharing the metadata you gather on these authors and their preferences for other libraries to use in their catalogs?
Yeah, we do have plans to present and share and publish the findings as we get down the road and share this out further, the cataloging records based on the author's preferences for that. If they want it shared out further or just add roots. So that's another one of our interview questions that we're asking about with that.
Thank you. And Avi and Amber, any thoughts on future?
Well, honestly, I'm excited and surprised that we still get to talk about this, because at this point, it was, 2 or 3 years ago that we were really in the weeds of these projects. So it's just really exciting to see that, the projects are moving forward and evolving in different ways, and people are still interested in engaging with it, and that it's out there in the world existing, and like people are still reading the work that we've produced previously. So yeah, I'd say for our projects that the best place to look is back at that paper that we linked in. There's a lot more detail in there. And we just really hope that it can serve as sort of an example for other people that are dealing with like small community library collections, because that's one of the reasons why we wanted to write stuff about it in the first place, is because when I was doing this research, it was really hard to find an example of a library that wasn't an academic library and it wasn't a community and it wasn't a public library, but instead like a queer run community library doing work like this. I don't know if you have anything to add, Avi.
Yeah, everything Amber said. but also I was really excited to see that Laura and Rio and the library as a whole are moving forward with working with Homosaurus and incorporating that, because when I started my project and when I was doing my main research stage, I believe Homosaurus was still in the first version, and that was just, it just didn't quite meet our needs. Our collection is only like 4,000 books, something like that. And yeah, it was just kind of like, I was like, this is a really cool thing that I don't think is going to work, and moved on. And so now getting to see how that's evolving is really exciting. Looking forward to see what you guys do.
Me too. I'm assuming this is for Adrian. Have you developed mappings of LCSH to Homo IT?
I have not. I've mostly just looked at what this would be in LCSH versus what it would be in Homosaurus. And so not a technological sort of mapping, just a in my head sort of mapping. Yeah.
All right, and two related questions for Adrian. Have you created, or are there plans to create, local authorities in your ALMA instance for any Homosaurus terms you've added? And do you add authority records for Homosaurus terms?
I don't add local headings, or rather local authorities for Homosaurus terms. It's a conversation that I'd like to have with my head of department in the future, but right now it's not something that we do at our libraries.
Follow-up from Adam Schiff is, if we had mappings, we might be able to automate additions to OCLC, develop a macro or something like that.
I agree. Oh, sorry, go on.
Ahead. For Heather, are you working with specific faculty in your work with students?
Certainly in a lot of the teaching that we do, and students kind of learn about our collections and learn about our opportunities through classes. So yeah, we have a lot of great partnerships with faculty and grad students who are often teaching kind of, some cases, the more interesting classes around queer topics. So that's a really good in for students that way. So yeah, they come to us from all areas.
Nice. And for Laura, Avi, Amber, and Rio, in getting input from users and also getting input from creators regarding subject terms, any thoughts on reconciling terms that users may identify with, but creators are not familiar with, and vice versa? Hope this makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting problem that I'm actually kind of excited to try to address when we get further down the road there in the interview process. We've had a couple of interesting occasions so far where, like in the interview we've already had, the preferred term this author had was one that would often be considered a slur, but that is their preferred term for themselves. So it's reconciling how to put that in the catalog and like acknowledge that it's probably not okay to use for the majority of the time, but in this case, this is a preference.
Nice. Yeah. All my favorite terms for myself are slurs at some point.
And I admire them. I was just going to say I admire them digging in the weeds, because I got lucky in a way that I could not get that complicated. I didn't have to dig into that much detail because we didn't want the system to be too big, the classification system. We didn't want it to be too cumbersome. We wanted to keep it small and simple and browsable. So I kind of got a free pass on having to dig into those details. So kudos to Rio and Avi and Laura and everyone who has to do all of the weeds there.
Yeah, one element that I didn't really have time to touch on in the presentation was our folksonomy side of things. So we had a social tagging system that you can activate in Koha, and that can give you a word cloud of tags, and it shows up on the records. And so part of the plan was to have very judicious moderating, which is not looking to exclude slurs, because we understand that many people identify with those, but more to give a little bit more consistency. We had like 3 different versions of how trans was written based on different capitalizations shorten it and all stuff like that. So that was mostly what we focused on, and that was how we got to work on that plurality aspect of cataloging for queer people.
Laura, did you have any? All right. For Heather, when you created the fellowship program, how did you begin to engage students in it, build interest in the program?
So I advertised everywhere, like the typical places, emails, table tents, flyers, but really what was most successful is getting the students that I already had relationships with to connect with other students. Students, I feel like, are always going to listen to other students over a librarian or a staff member. So I had students connect on social media with student groups. I would have them come to classes and do the little song and dance. And I think that worked really well. And I continue to do that to bring in former fellows to kind of help with promotion, bring in other students to find the places that I don't know about where the students are kind of paying attention. So that kind of helped. And then every year, sort of the momentum has built through just sort of students hearing about the program or hearing about projects and things like that. So that has helped.
Nice, cool kids. For Emily, your project sounds fascinating, but very labor intensive. Have you thought about ways you might be able to streamline the work, and if someone else wanted to do the same analysis of the collection? Sorry.
It was very labor intensive, but it basically was a work from home project where we had never worked from home before. So we were figuring out, oh God, how do you do archives from home when all the archives are at the Library of Congress? So by nature of being labor intensive, it gave me something to do, really. And the entire time I was doing it, I was like, there must be a faster way to do this. And I did not come up with anything. If anyone has ideas, I would love to hear them. My basic suggestion is just like, as I was going through all of the indexing terms, I kept just a Word document open about like, oh, this person, I found them, they identified as gay. And so when I saw them later again, I could be like, oh yes, it's that guy, okay. But that was really the only way I found to make it any faster. But yeah, if anyone has ideas, I would love to hear them.
And the follow-up to the first part of your answer to that was, we know exactly what you mean. Adrian, thank you for doing this great work. Are you focusing on more recent or older materials? If older materials, how do you and/or Homosaurus deal with changes in preferred terminology among queer communities?
Yeah, so I've been working on all materials, more recent and older, and ways that I deal with these older terms are that I just look at the context of the situation. If it's about someone who identified as a transvestite, obviously that's a term that we don't use anymore, but Homosaurus has that term for those people. And that is, if that is what the person used, and that's the term that I'm going to use. There are also times where the LCSH term sexual minorities would be used for books that were exclusively about lesbians and gays. And that's obviously not accurate. And so I was able to just add the Homosaurus terms, lesbians, gays. And I couldn't take sexual minorities off of that because I couldn't remove LCSH. But I could add those more accurate terms to those older works.
Lovely. And another question for you, Adrian. How will you deal with workflows involving copy cataloging? Will you run a list of, sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you.
I think it's the other way around. Will you run a list of records added to enhance later, or will the enhancement be made as part of the copy cataloging workflow?
It'll be done as part of the workflow. A maybe unique aspect of our libraries is that all of the subject assignment and classification is done by faculty catalogers. And so we are trained to make those decisions and to participate in that sort of policy process. Yeah, so staff that are doing more already complete records, just exporting that. If they, as I said toward the end of my presentation, I hope to have a discussion with our department about adding Homosaurus as part of our process. And so when they see an LGBTQ book coming through acquisitions, hopefully it can be routed to me and I can do that classification work right then. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Comment from Rachel Newland. We tried it as part of the workflow and the copy catalogers just didn't do it. I'm running a report and adding after the fact. But to Adrian's point, it is a group of cataloging librarians and paraprofessionals.
That makes sense, Rachel. And I definitely foresee having, to do that as well. And I'm open to that possibility.
Adam says, our copy catalogers are not trained to do subject assignments. And Finch Collins says, I applied to the fellowship after seeing a post in the newsletter. Also, the fellowship was paid. That's a significant draw for students. Thank you. Last call for questions for these presenters. All right, I would, sorry, looking through the chat for any questions I missed. Apologies if anything has fallen through the cracks. Go ahead and throw that back in if I missed it. Otherwise, I would like to thank all of our,
not something that I thought you missed. I just want to give a little bit of attribution here at the end. I think my project, Avi's project, Rio and Laura's, and all of the other projects going on in relation to UBC need to give a lot of credit to Dr. Julia Bullard, who is here in the audience, I think, and who has used a lot of institutional power that she's got as a faculty member to support these initiatives and to make them possible and to mentor a lot of students and help us do all of these things. So I just want to throw that out there to say thanks for making all of this possible, because it would have been a lot more difficult without her help.
Thank you very much. Have a couple minutes. Does anybody else need to thank someone real quick? This is your Oscars moment. All right, we've got a lot of messages of support and thanks for y'all in the chat. So happy to see early career librarians paving the way with this work. Lots and lots of clapping emojis. So yeah, I'm gonna close us out. Thank you so much for all of our presenters for sharing. Apologies to anyone's questions I dropped or names I mispronounced. Please know I have so much respect and gratitude for you all. It's been such a wonderful event. And I would like to thank our back ends people who you haven't seen, but John Jackson and Carol Robbie are running the show behind the scenes, and Peter Ralla helped me and them plan the symposium. And thank you to the Dean for funding this. All right, I will, y'all are off the hook. Thank you very much. Thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us. All of the recordings that we got consent to post afterwards will be posted to our YouTube page once those videos get edited. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a beautiful day.